The portrait hung for over a century without causing so much as a pause. A woman seated upright in fine fabric, her expression composed, her gaze steady. Beside her stood a slave, eyes lowered, hands folded, positioned carefully to communicate obedience. It was the kind of image museums passed over without comment, a quiet artifact of a brutal system so familiar it no longer shocked. Visitors glanced at it and moved on. Archivists catalogued it and forgot it. Time did the rest. That changed the moment the canvas was removed from its frame. Under modern light, the image behaved differently. The shadows were heavier than they should have been. The space between the two figures felt strained, as if something unseen occupied it. A restoration specialist, trained to notice what others overlook, paused at the slave's hands. They were not empty. What looked like a crease in fabric was something else entirely, intentionally blended into the grain of the photograph. Too precise to be an accident. Too deliberate to be decorative. As layers of dust and age were stripped away, the portrait began to resist its own story. Pigment shifts suggested parts of the image had been darkened by human hands, not time. The woman's calm expression no longer read as confidence but control, sharpened by fear. And the slave's posture, once interpreted as submission, now looked like restraint. Records from the plantation told an incomplete tale. Birth logs ended abruptly. Deaths were recorded without explanation. A child appeared in census data with no mother listed, then vanished entirely from history. Names repeated where they should not have. Dates overlapped in impossible ways. Each discovery tightened the sense that this portrait was never meant to survive scrutiny. The image was not documentation. It was concealment. What experts slowly came to understand was that the portrait captured a moment that violated the laws of its time, not just socially, but criminally. It was proof of something forbidden, something that demanded silence to protect power and destroy those without it. The photograph had been altered, hidden, and reframed to neutralize its threat, left behind as a lie that looked harmless enough to endure. And now, after more than 100 years, the portrait was finally telling the truth. For decades, the portrait existed in a state of perfect invisibility, not because it was hidden away, but because it looked exactly like what everyone expected it to be. A plantation owner seated with composed elegance and a slave positioned beside her was such a common visual language of the 19th century that the mind learned to process it without thought. It belonged to a category so familiar it became background noise. The image never provoked outrage, curiosity, or even discomfort beyond the dull, inherited awareness of a cruel system long discussed and long compartmentalized. It was filed, archived, and reproduced as a textbook example of social hierarchy, nothing more. The portrait first surfaced in a private Southern collection in the late 19th century, passed down through a family that claimed ancestral ties to the plantation. It was treated as a relic of prestige rather than evidence of anything darker. Guests admired the quality of the work, the expensive clothing, the sharpness of the woman's features. The presence of the slave was acknowledged only as context, a visual footnote that reinforced the owner's status. No one questioned why this particular image was preserved when so many others were lost. No one asked why it was framed so carefully or why it never left the family's possession for public display until long after those who knew its origin were gone. When the portrait was eventually donated to a regional historical archive, it was catalogued with clinical simplicity. The description was brief, almost dismissive. Date uncertain. Subjects unidentified beyond their social roles. Condition stable. Significance moderate. It joined hundreds of similar artifacts that documented plantation life without interrogating it. Historians studying the era were drawn to letters, land records, and economic data, not images that seemed to confirm what was already known. The portrait's familiarity worked as camouflage, allowing it to survive scrutiny by appearing unremarkable. Even during periods when scholars began re-examining slavery with greater honesty, the image escaped attention. It was too static, too posed, too ordinary to invite reinterpretation. There was no visible violence, no dramatic gesture, no overt cruelty. It showed order, not chaos. Control, not conflict. In a field often driven by extremes, this quiet image offered nothing sensational on the surface. It reinforced the sanitized narrative of domestic stability that plantation owners once worked hard to project, and that projection continued to function long after their world collapsed. Museum visitors passed by it quickly, their eyes trained to seek emotional cues. They lingered over photographs of scars, chains, and auction blocks, then glanced at the portrait and moved on. The woman's posture was calm. The slave's gaze was lowered. The scene appeared complete. There was nothing to resolve, nothing to question. It communicated exactly what it was meant to communicate, even to modern viewers who believed themselves more perceptive than generations before them. What made the portrait especially resistant to suspicion was its technical quality. It was professionally composed, balanced, and carefully lit. The craftsmanship suggested legitimacy. Amateur images sometimes invite doubt because of their imperfections, but this portrait felt authoritative. It looked official, as if sanctioned by history itself. That authority discouraged closer inspection. People tend to trust images that appear deliberate and polished, assuming their meaning is transparent because their execution is controlled. The archive staff responsible for its care had no reason to treat it differently from the dozens of other plantation portraits under their supervision. Budget constraints limited deep analysis. Time pressures encouraged surface-level classification. The image did not demand attention, and so it never received it. Its secrets were protected not by locks or lies, but by routine. Years turned into decades. The portrait survived relocations, storage changes, and even minor restorations without triggering alarm. Each handling reinforced its accepted identity. Labels were copied from old records without revision. Assumptions hardened into fact through repetition. The longer it existed unquestioned, the safer it became. History has a way of rewarding conformity, and the portrait conformed perfectly to expectation. What no one realized was that this ordinariness was not accidental. The image had been designed to disappear in plain sight. Its composition followed conventions precisely because conventions discourage scrutiny. It mirrored thousands of other portraits intentionally, blending into a visual tradition that dulled curiosity. If it had been strange, it might have been investigated. If it had been emotional, it might have been discussed. Instead, it was calm, balanced, and silent. By the time modern technology and shifting historical perspectives made deeper analysis possible, the portrait had already completed its long task of waiting. It had outlived its creators, its witnesses, and its immediate consequences. It had watched generations accept it at face value, never suspecting that the most dangerous evidence is often the kind that looks the least threatening, the kind that teaches you how to look away before you even realize you are choosing not to see, and so the portrait remained exactly where it was, hanging quietly, performing obedience to history itself, concealing within its stillness a truth that required no effort to hide because no one thought to ask why it had been kept at all, or what kind of story would need a century of silence to survive the moment suspicion entered the room. It did not arrive with drama or certainty, but with hesitation. It came as a pause that lasted a fraction longer than necessary, the kind of pause that only occurs when something fails to align with expectation. The restoration expert had seen thousands of historical images, understood the patterns of aging, the predictable ways light, dust, and neglect transform old photographs and paintings. This portrait, however, reacted differently under examination. It was not damaged in the way time usually damages things. It felt interfered with. The process began routinely. The frame was removed to assess structural integrity, and the surface was illuminated with angled light meant to reveal cracks and previous restoration work. Almost immediately, the shadows in the lower half of the image seemed heavier than logic allowed. The contrast around the slave's torso was inconsistent with the rest of the composition, as though darkness had been selectively encouraged to settle there. At first, this was attributed to uneven exposure or early photographic limitations. But the longer the expert observed it, the less convincing that explanation became. Attention shifted to the slave's posture. In plantation portraits, enslaved individuals were often positioned stiffly, arranged to communicate submission through stillness. This posture matched that expectation, but something about the hands felt unresolved. They were folded, yes, but the tension suggested effort rather than rest. The fingers appeared to curl around empty space, their shape implying resistance to release. It was a subtle detail, one easily dismissed by the untrained eye, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. Using magnification, the expert traced the lines around the hands. What initially read as deep shadow revealed unnatural edges. The darkness was too precise, too contained. Pigment analysis suggested the area had been worked more than the surrounding regions. Someone had returned to this part of the image after its initial creation. Not to repair it, but to suppress something. The strokes were careful, almost reverent, as if the person altering the image understood the danger of drawing attention. Infrared imaging was introduced to penetrate the visible layers. Beneath the surface, a faint outline emerged. It was not a clear object, but its geometry was unmistakable. Straight lines where there should have been none. A deliberate shape concealed by overlapping tones. The expert adjusted the settings repeatedly, each pass revealing more of the same suggestion. Whatever the slave had been holding, it had not been decorative. It had not been neutral. At the same time, inconsistencies appeared in the surrounding fabric. The folds of clothing near the hands did not flow naturally. They bent around the hidden form, accommodating its presence before it was erased. The image betrayed its own revision. The expert recognized this pattern from other cases, usually involving censored political material or posthumous alterations made to preserve reputations. The intent was not artistic improvement, but historical correction. The discovery reframed the entire portrait. What once seemed like passive compliance now appeared as containment. The slave was not standing calmly. He was being fixed in place. His lowered gaze no longer suggested obedience but calculation, the quiet focus of someone aware that even a slight movement could expose what had been hidden. The tension in his hands transformed from ambiguity into warning. The expert documented everything carefully, aware that conclusions without evidence would be dismissed. High-resolution scans were taken. Spectral data was logged. Each irregularity was mapped and compared to known restoration techniques of the period. The alterations were old, contemporary with the portrait itself, which meant the concealment had occurred almost immediately after the image was created. Someone had recognized the risk early and acted decisively. As the analysis continued, the expert noticed something else. The woman's gaze, previously described as neutral, now seemed directed not at the viewer, but downward. Her eyes did not meet the camera fully. They hovered, fixed just slightly below center, aligned with the area of alteration. It was the look of someone monitoring rather than posing. Her calm expression took on a new meaning, not serenity, but control maintained through awareness. The object remained partially obscured, but its presence was undeniable. It could not be dismissed as a tool or ornament. The way it was hidden suggested significance beyond symbolism. This was something that should not have been documented, something whose visibility would have transformed the image from a statement of power into evidence of transgression. The expert understood that the portrait had never been meant for public consumption in its original form. It had been revised to survive. By the end of the examination, the expert no longer saw a historical artifact, but a crime scene frozen in time. The image was not a reflection of the past, but a negotiation with it. Every shadow was intentional. Every revision was a decision. The hands that altered the portrait had done so with urgency, guided by fear of discovery rather than concern for aesthetics. What unsettled the expert most was how easily the secret had remained hidden. It was not buried deep beneath layers of paint or locked behind inaccessible technology. It was concealed through subtlety, relying on the assumption that no one would look closely at a slave's hands in a portrait designed to emphasize someone else's authority, and that assumption had held true for over a century, allowing the image to exist comfortably in archives and galleries, silently carrying the shape of something forbidden, waiting for a moment when someone finally allowed their attention to rest where history had trained them not to look once the physical irregularities of the portrait were documented. Attention shifted away from the image itself and toward the world that had produced it. Images rarely exist in isolation, and whatever had been hidden in shadow must have left traces elsewhere. Historians and archivists began with plantation records, expecting routine confirmations of ownership, births, and transactions. What they found instead was absence. Ledgers that should have spanned decades stopped abruptly, as if someone had decided a story no longer needed to continue. Pages were missing, not torn out violently, but removed cleanly, suggesting deliberate revision rather than damage. The woman in the portrait was easier to trace at first. Her family name appeared frequently in land deeds and tax assessments, always precise, always orderly. But when researchers followed her personal timeline, something strange emerged. In 1 year, she was recorded as unmarried. In the next, she appeared as a widow, despite no marriage record ever being filed and no husband ever appearing in local registries. The explanation was never given, only accepted. In an era obsessed with documentation, that silence was meaningful. Attention turned to household records, where enslaved individuals were listed as property. Names appeared and disappeared without explanation, but one entry drew immediate concern. A male slave of the same approximate age as the man in the portrait was recorded for several years, then abruptly reassigned to another plantation owned by distant relatives. The transfer date did not align with any known sale, nor did it reflect market patterns of the time. No payment was listed. No contract survived. It was as if the transaction had been intentionally obscured. Birth records deepened the unease. A child appeared in the county registry, listed without a mother, an anomaly even in slave documentation. The father was not named, but the timing aligned closely with the period the portrait was believed to have been taken. The child's name appeared once, then vanished entirely from future census records. No death certificate. No sale. No relocation. Just erasure. In communities where people were tracked obsessively for labor and inheritance, disappearance without explanation was rare. Church archives provided further fractures. Baptism records included a child whose surname had been altered after the fact, overwritten carefully in a different hand. Marriage logs referenced a ceremony that could not be corroborated elsewhere, attended by witnesses who, according to other records, were not present in the county at the time. Each inconsistency alone could be dismissed as clerical error. Together, they formed a pattern of correction, as if history itself had been edited repeatedly to maintain a version that no longer matched reality. The deeper researchers went, the more they encountered name changes that did not follow legal procedure. A woman of similar age to the plantation owner appeared briefly under a different surname in neighboring counties, then disappeared. The timing suggested relocation under pressure rather than choice. Letters from relatives referenced a matter resolved and necessary discretion, phrases vague enough to mean nothing and everything. The language of avoidance was unmistakable. Even legal disputes from the period hinted at something unspoken. A land disagreement involving the plantation was settled unusually quickly, with no surviving transcripts of testimony. Judges known for meticulous record-keeping left behind only final rulings, stripped of context. Financial penalties were waived. Certain documents were sealed indefinitely. These were privileges not granted lightly, and certainly not without reason. As archives were cross-referenced, historians realized entire threads of lineage had been quietly redirected. Children who should have inherited property did not. Assets were transferred to distant cousins. Wills contradicted earlier declarations without explanation. Inheritance lines bent unnaturally, as though someone had gone to great effort to ensure that specific connections were never made visible. Genealogical gaps emerged exactly where scrutiny would have been most damaging. What became increasingly clear was that the portrait represented more than a moment. It marked a rupture. After the estimated date of its creation, records grew cautious, vague, and selectively silent. Before it, documentation was confident and detailed. After it, language softened, references blurred, and certainty dissolved into implication. The portrait sat at the center of this shift, a fixed point around which reality had been reorganized. Historians began to suspect that the image had captured a truth that could not be allowed to stand unaltered. The forbidden nature of what it implied would have carried legal, social, and economic consequences severe enough to destroy not just reputations, but entire bloodlines. In a system built on rigid boundaries, any violation threatened the legitimacy of power itself. Silence became a survival strategy, not only for those directly involved, but for institutions invested in preserving order. By the time the research reached its conclusion, the portrait no longer felt like an artifact among others. It felt like an anchor, holding down a carefully submerged narrative. The missing records, altered names, and unexplained disappearances were not random failures of preservation. They were coordinated absences, shaped by fear and authority, leaving behind a history that appeared intact only because its most dangerous elements had been removed so thoroughly that generations accepted the remaining fragments as complete, never realizing that what had been lost was not accidental decay but intentional forgetting, enforced so consistently that the gaps themselves became invisible to everyone except those who finally learned how to read silence as evidence the scientific. Examination began with restraint, guided by the understanding that the portrait had already survived one deliberate manipulation and might not withstand another. Every decision was measured, every technique chosen for what it could reveal without further altering the surface. High-resolution multispectral imaging was employed first, allowing analysts to see beyond what the human eye could register. Under these wavelengths, the image fractured into layers of intent. What appeared uniform in visible light separated into zones of interference, where pigment density shifted abruptly without artistic justification. X-ray fluorescence mapping exposed inconsistencies in the chemical composition of the paint. Certain areas contained elements that did not belong to the original palette used during the period in which the portrait was created. These materials were introduced later, applied with precision to mask rather than embellish. The concentration of these foreign pigments clustered around the slave's hands and the space between the two figures, confirming that the alterations were localized and purposeful. This was not routine touch-up work. It was concealment. Digital reconstruction techniques allowed analysts to simulate the removal of the added layers without physically disturbing the artwork. As the later pigments were digitally subtracted, the image beneath emerged slowly, like a confession extracted one detail at a time. The outline that had once been faint became undeniable. The object concealed in the slave's hands was not symbolic, nor incidental. Its form was rigid, angular, and unmistakably man-made. The way it intersected with the composition suggested it had been central to the original image, not an afterthought. Further analysis revealed that the original photograph had been altered within a remarkably short time after it was taken. Chemical aging markers indicated the masking pigments were applied while the base layers were still relatively fresh. This meant the decision to erase part of the image occurred almost immediately, likely by someone who understood exactly what the portrait showed and what it risked revealing. There had been no long period of reconsideration. The response was swift, driven by urgency. Microscopic examination of brushwork told its own story. The strokes used to obscure the object were tighter and more controlled than the original artist's hand, lacking the fluidity of creative expression. They were utilitarian, executed with the singular goal of elimination. In some areas, the pressure of the brush suggested hesitation, as if the person applying it understood the gravity of what they were covering. This was not the work of a restorer generations later, but of someone present in the moment, close enough to feel the consequences. The scientific findings also challenged long-held assumptions about the portrait's authenticity. While the overall image was genuine, it had been transformed into a curated version of itself, engineered to survive public exposure without scrutiny. The object, once visible, would have reframed the entire composition, turning a display of dominance into documentation of transgression. Its removal restored the image to something socially acceptable, something that aligned with the narrative of control rather than undermining it. Even the lighting of the original portrait took on new meaning. Analysis showed subtle adjustments in shadow placement that guided the viewer's attention away from the altered area. These changes were not inherent to the original capture but introduced during the modification process. Darkness was used strategically, not aesthetically. The portrait had been taught how to be ignored. As the data accumulated, analysts recognized that the alterations were sophisticated for their time. This was not a crude act of defacement, but a calculated intervention informed by an understanding of visual perception. The person responsible knew where eyes would linger and where they would not. They knew that viewers trained to focus on symbols of wealth and authority would rarely scrutinize the hand of an enslaved person positioned as secondary. The science confirmed what history suggested: the concealment relied as much on social conditioning as on material alteration. When the reconstructed image was viewed in full, the portrait's emotional temperature shifted. The relationship between the figures no longer read as static. It vibrated with tension. The proximity between the woman and the slave became charged, no longer decorative but dangerous. The object between them acted as a silent accusation, implicating both in a reality that contradicted the rigid boundaries their society depended upon. The portrait had not merely been softened. It had been disarmed. The final confirmation came from comparative analysis with other works by the same artist. No similar alterations appeared elsewhere. This portrait was unique in its revision, reinforcing the conclusion that the change was driven by circumstance rather than habit. The artist, or whoever controlled the image afterward, had been forced to intervene, to choose preservation over truth. Science did not just expose the alteration. It exposed the fear behind it. By proving that the portrait had been deliberately changed to erase evidence, the scientific analysis transformed speculation into fact. The image was no longer a passive relic but an active participant in its own survival, shaped by hands that understood the cost of honesty in their world. The forbidden secret was not simply hidden by time. It had been hunted down, covered carefully, and left behind in a form designed to endure, trusting that future generations would accept what they saw and never ask what had been removed, never question why the most telling part of the image had been forced into darkness, or why the truth required such immediate and calculated silence to remain intact. The final realization did not arrive as a single revelation but as a convergence of conclusions that could no longer be separated. Historians, scientists, and archivists compared their findings independently, then together, and each discipline arrived at the same unsettling truth from a different direction. The portrait was not merely altered to protect an individual reputation. It was altered to prevent a collapse. What it documented threatened the structure of an entire social order, one that depended on rigid divisions and the illusion of moral authority to function. The illegal relationship implied by the image violated laws that were enforced selectively but punished mercilessly when exposure became unavoidable. These laws were not only about race or ownership, but about inheritance, legitimacy, and the transmission of power. A child born from such a union would not fit into the legal categories of the time. They could not be openly acknowledged without destabilizing property rights and family lineage. Their existence alone would challenge the very logic used to justify slavery and hierarchy. The portrait captured proof of that contradiction in a form that could not be argued away if fully visible. Experts began to understand that the true danger was not scandal, but documentation. Rumors could be silenced. Witnesses could be discredited or removed. But an image, once accepted as authentic, had authority. It froze reality into a form that resisted reinterpretation. If the original version of the portrait had circulated, it would have raised questions that could not be contained within private conversation. It would have forced legal scrutiny, church intervention, and public acknowledgement. The consequences would not have stopped with one household. They would have spread outward, implicating institutions that preferred ignorance over reform. The alterations to the portrait were therefore not an act of shame, but of defense. They represented a decision to preserve the system rather than the truth. By removing the most incriminating element, those responsible transformed evidence into decoration. The image could then serve its intended secondary purpose, reinforcing authority instead of undermining it. What remained was a version of reality that aligned with the expectations of the time, allowing everyone involved to continue as though nothing had happened. Genealogists examining the aftermath saw how thoroughly the correction had been enforced. Bloodlines were redirected. Children were reassigned identities or erased entirely. Legal documents were rewritten to maintain separation where nature had violated it. The portrait stood at the beginning of this process, the first object that needed to be neutralized before the larger work of concealment could proceed. Once it was altered, everything else could be adjusted to match the lie it presented. What disturbed experts most was the level of coordination implied. This was not the action of a single fearful individual acting impulsively. It required access, influence, and cooperation. Artists, clerks, officials, and family members all had roles to play, whether knowingly or not. Silence became institutional. The secret was protected not by one wall, but by many layers of compliance, each reinforcing the next. Over time, the original truth became irrelevant to those who inherited the revised version of events, because the lie had been normalized. The portrait's endurance was proof of the success of that strategy. For generations, it functioned exactly as intended. It blended into collections, confirmed assumptions, and discouraged inquiry. Its survival ensured that the forbidden relationship it once documented remained unspoken, even as the people directly affected by it vanished from record. The system had not only hidden its crime, it had outlived it. As historians reconstructed the implications, they realized the portrait was not unique in concept, only in survival. Similar relationships undoubtedly existed, but few left behind such clear evidence. Most were erased before documentation could occur, their stories lost entirely. This image slipped through because it was transformed quickly enough to pass as harmless. Its altered form allowed it to persist where others were destroyed. Ironically, the attempt to hide the truth ensured that some trace of it would remain. The recognition that an entire lineage had been reshaped to avoid exposure reframed the portrait's significance. It was no longer a single artifact with a hidden detail. It was a pressure point where power, fear, and identity converged. The experts understood that revealing the secret now would not undo the harm it once prevented, but it would expose the mechanisms by which history had been controlled. It demonstrated how easily official narratives could be engineered, and how thoroughly they could be accepted if presented with enough confidence and repetition. The portrait's forbidden secret was therefore not limited to the relationship it concealed. It revealed something broader and more unsettling, that history often survives not as a record of what happened, but as a record of what was allowed to be known. The image had been permitted to exist only after it was stripped of its most dangerous truth, and that permission had shaped how generations understood the past. By uncovering what was removed, experts were not just correcting one story, but challenging the reliability of countless others built on similar omissions. In the end, the portrait stood as evidence of a crime that could no longer be prosecuted, a relationship that could no longer be punished, and a lineage that could no longer be restored, but its exposure mattered because it revealed the cost of silence, showing how far power would go to protect itself, how deeply it could rewrite reality, and how many lives could be erased not by violence alone, but by the quiet, systematic refusal to let the truth be seen at all. The portrait was returned to public view with a new label, stripped of certainty and heavy with implication. Visitors no longer passed it without stopping. They stood longer now, their eyes drawn not to the woman's composed expression, but to the space where something had once been forced into darkness. The image no longer confirmed what history claimed to be true. It questioned it. What had once functioned as decoration became an accusation, not only of one forbidden act, but of a system that survived by deciding which truths were allowed to exist. The slave's lowered gaze, once dismissed as obedience, now felt deliberate, as if he had always known the image would outlast those who tried to silence it. And in that quiet knowledge, preserved against all efforts to erase it, the portrait finally completed its task, no longer protecting power, but exposing the fragile fear that had shaped generations of lies into something people mistook for history.